Testing, now it's working. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. I believe it's now, it was telling me my speaker wasn't working when I would pause the recording. So had to, I don't know if you got all that, but anyway, now it's working. So good morning. This is the video that I'll be posting in lieu of our class next week. So we'll meet tomorrow, but then we won't meet on the 28th. Because quite frankly, I'll be in Florida with my son, something we arranged. And it's the only week my son would have the time that my son, who had been in Kuwait, would have the time to go do a little vacation with us. I will be, and I'll talk about this tomorrow. So I will be available for Zoom meetings during the week, particularly for Connor, who still needs to get his midterm observation in, but anyone else that might need me. So we're going to talk about what I call the curriculum of place. I'm going to talk mainly about the power of place reading. There's two readings. I would say the second reading, I think you can scan through it. I don't think you need to do a deep reading because it's basically telling you how to apply local place examples to the standards. Now, the example mostly is from Vermont. Particularly, you're talking to you about rural schools, which, I think some of our schools could be considered rural, although maybe not in the same sense. Really, most of the schools in Lafourche and Terrebonne, if they're not urban-ish, they're small townish. But I think small town, still applies, urban still applies to this idea of teaching from the local. And this is something I harp on when I review your lesson plans, trying to really dig into local examples and using locality, using local place, which is both physical, but it's also social. How we organize our communities. So the better you understand how a community is organized, then the better you are able to use that in really some ways juxtapose it. I think the best juxtaposition, okay, is most of our governance is done by some sort of representational system in which we vote for a representative, be it local, city, parish, school board, statewide or national, okay? I cringe, quite frankly, whenever I hear media, particularly in national politicians, talk about town hall, okay? Town halls were exclusive to the New England experience, a little bit so into the upper Midwest, say upper Ohio, upper Michigan, or Michigan, Wisconsin, who were populated by people who migrated from New England into that area. Okay. Everybody else doesn't, there was no town hall tradition. And the purpose, and what really irritates me is the purpose of town halls is not really to hear everybody, it's to construct consensus. Okay. And consensus constructing is a coercive process, if you really think about it. So these people that talk about, let's say, when it comes to climate change, that there's consensus on the science. Basically, what they're telling you is if you have an opposing view, it's illegitimate, and therefore we're not going to listen to it. And it's really putting down your freedom of speech to talk about issues. Same is true with a lot of this vaccination stuff and how to best respond to COVID. There's a lot of information out there, but some of it, good information out there, but some of it isn't driving policy because there are other purposes, political purposes behind our COVID policies. And that's very concerning because political forces in this country today are trying to drive consensus. In other words, shutting off voices of opposition. And that's what that's the town hall approach, quite frankly. So it's, that's social. That's how understanding the social environment, the cultural environment, and how we do things, is part of the local as well. And there's an interrelationship between the social and the geographical, particularly if you understand the density of population of colonial New England, particularly Boston, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and in some degree, southeastern New Hampshire, versus the disbursement of people in both the upland and lowland South. And we're part of the, I would argue we're very much part of the lowland South in our area. So there are not a lot of towns. We've seen the rise of cities in recent history, but that's not our tradition. Okay, so let me pop up. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, here we go, with my notes from The Power of Place. That's Bishop's article. I think it's an excellent article. And basically the argument is place-based education helps us better understand our lives and our work, particularly as teachers. It gives us concrete context. It's not all abstract. And it helps the teacher and the student better understand how our local history, let's say, and local governance fits into the national picture in terms of and how our geography fits into the national picture. We have a very unique geography. It's a very important geography. And if we understand that if our geography is lost, particularly our wetlands, how that's going to create a serious impact on the country as a whole. Okay. It also, because we're in the Gulf South, we are part and parcel not just to the United States experience, but also the Caribbean experience, Latin America, Mexico, South America. So we're part of that Caribbean context, particularly New Orleans, but also I would argue, the home of Thibodaux area. Why do we grow sugarcane? We grow sugarcane because it was brought from Saint-Domingue or Haiti by refugees who left Haiti during the slave rebellion in the late, very late 18th century. Some of my family is part of that migration of refugees, because most of those people left Haiti in Argentine, which was the name of the French colony before Haitian independence, and came to Louisiana, came to the Gulf Coast. And they brought with them sugarcane production. And it's those, so sugarcane was, sugar was granulated, refined into, let's just say molasses was refined into sugar in Louisiana, where Audubon Park essentially is, and Neil Boré was the plantation owner. The kettle that was used to do that sits out in front of the chemical engineering building at LSU, which then you go, well, how is sugar refining part of chemical engineering? Well, it's really the nascent technology that leads to broader chemical engineering. So you see there the local connections to a number of different things. Anyway, so again, all that helps you better understand our lives, our relationships. Those of us who are in education are part of an academic world, part of an academic culture, a learned culture, a literate culture. And the story I just relayed is part of that. In the role of Black Africans in that process is fundamental. So their contributions to that is fundamental. The modern process of refining sugar was done by a former slave from New Orleans, who got educated and lived in France and created the first, created the process to refine sugar in a modern sense. That we still pretty much use today, okay? And made sugar an essential item in our world, not just for drinking sweet drinks or eating candy, but for all sorts of processes, okay? Because sugar was very rare prior to that point. I've got my crank collars, warranty collars are on the phone now. Bishop talks about, if reading about how she uses local literature in her ELA class. Well, I'm going to argue that if reading literature, both nonfiction and fiction, is important for ELA, then even more so for social studies. Local libraries, as well as the Nichols Archive in the Eleanor Library, are very good sources for local literature. You need to, one of the things you can do is go to the local parish library. We have one of the best local library systems in the country, thanks to some very foresighted people and some politicians. And part of that comes out of the age when education wasn't readily available. So in the time of COVID, the local library may be even more important, more so than the school library, places for students to go and work and find things. So use your local library sources, the parish library sources, to really get a sense of local literature, possibly some of our local museums as well. may also be a resource. So you need to use those resources. Um, Clearly, too, that as I talk about this, I'm really talking in terms of future, not necessarily just for the moment. Since you all, um, we're trying to get through your first residency, as convoluted as it has become because of Ida. Hopefully, next semester will be a lot smoother. And maybe you'll have more time, you'll have less work to do in courses. So you may have some more time to do the kinds of research that you really need to do. But again, the internet may still be one of the best sources for general information. But you have to get to know your community and get to know your world much more so. And part of this is, again, the lack of place-based education in your, particularly in your secondary, middle school and secondary educations. Okay. We recognize that the place or the places we live works to identify and shape who we are. Okay. We have a particular sense of movement because we live along bayous. We don't float up and down the bayous, but notice that majority of our roads parallel the bayous. So we're still moving up and down bayous to get to places. There aren't as many across from bayou to bayou roads. There may be 1, 2, or 3, depending on population. Think about trying to get from Houma to Thibodaux. We're still basically using a road that parallels Bayou Terrebonne, even though Bayou Terrebonne doesn't really function as a distributary as it once did. We've really outgrown that road between Houma and Thibodaux. We need an expressway, which would be great, which would be a great benefit to both. And maybe it's coming. I know there's a new road that's supposed to be built between Vacherie and Thibodaux, and it may extend into Houma itself. So, the way we gather, the way we socialize, very much part of who we are. So place is very important to our own personal identities. I still have for instance, I still have a strong sense of being from New Orleans. For years, I basically, many years I lived in Baton Rouge, I basically told people I was from New Orleans. That's who I identified with. I'm less, I think less in those terms. And I think that's partly because my children have grown up in Baton Rouge. So that adult experience is more pertinent to my identity than my younger years, teenage years particularly, growing up in the big city. So the place, the second sentence in this little paragraph is the place that we live in is part of the other that we interact with. So the other here, there's a whole literature on the other, philosophical, psychological literature on the sense of the other. And we understand that we are shaped largely by how others react to us, how we engage the other. And so a lot of this is about people, but this is also about place. It's also about our geography, our sense of safety, um, within a place, our sense of our ability to thrive as human beings. And that's part of what you're trying to do for your students, is helping them recognize how they are able to thrive as they move from teenage years, preteen and teenage years, into adulthood. So that's part of the importance in helping them negotiate place and space. So there's also the idea of space within place. I've had a couple of other readings that my grad level methods classes would read. Is important. So when a community loses a school, it may also lose its identity. So I'm really thinking about pre and post Ida. Pre-Ida, the Pointe-aux-Chenes Elementary was closed at the end of last year. The school that served a primarily Native American community, both in Pointe-aux-Chenes and Ile-de-Charles, which are places that we are destined to lose because they both sit outside of the new protection levee that, if not built, is being built by the Corps of Engineers. So, and I find things like this tragic. So, and with the loss of those places, you're going to lose what has been traditional ways of working and livelihood, the fishing, trapping, and those types of things. And that's not far behind. I think I'm not sure where we are, because it's been 15 years since 15 years since Katrina and Rita. But I began being told that after Rita particularly, attitudes towards education began to change among these communities because they recognize that their traditional ways of living are going to slowly be destroyed. And they recognize that opportunity comes with education. And not necessarily going to university, but particularly, getting that high school degree so you can work a trades job or go to trade school, these types of things. So finding other ways to live. I've been down there. I've been part of a project down there, oral history project that was down there years, just after Katrina and Rita. Although it's been a few years since I've been down that way. So I get concerned. I'm now concerned about Grand Isle. Do we have the political will to save Grand Isle? I think is an important factor. I know attempts going to be made to rebuild it. So it may hang around, but we know that other barrier islands are slowly disappearing on either side of Grand Isle. Maybe one day, and maybe the somewhat distant future, all we'll have down there is maybe Port Fourchon, in a elevated bridge to that area that plays such a vital role. Now, other political factors, economic factors, may bring an end to offshore Oil drilling, I don't know. Can't predict the future, which, would be, of course, devastating. So the big problem going forward is where do we put all the people that live down the Bayou Lafourche and Bayou Terrebonne? I mean, uh, Grand Caillou, I guess. Montague, Chauvin, those areas. So where do we put these people? Where do they end up? Is there enough, is there enough space to put them, let's say, north of Cutoff, north of Raceland? These are going to be important questions. We will see what the outmigration because of Ida will be from Lower Lafourche. And there may be less so in Lower Terrebonne, but time will tell. And where will they go? And to what degree is that temporary in terms of the long range prospects for maintaining our wetlands, particularly in the Barataria, larger Barataria estuary region, which we've done little to protect it. We're doing some things in Upper Barataria with the Davis Pond project. There've been proposals to move to allow the Bayou Lafourche to become a distributary of the Mississippi again, which would help parts of Barataria. We certainly need projects coming off of the west bank of the lower Mississippi that would also help those areas. But again, the cost is phenomenal, and it may just be cheaper to move people. It's a way of life. But we need to, one of the important reasons to teach from the local for us, to teach about our wetlands, to teach about our history, our connections, is that we can, if we don't teach, then students lose the ability to imagine how to continue to live here. So it's a combination of losing hope and losing the imagination with that. But I think it comes first with the imagination. So if we're not teaching the local, then we can no longer imagine. We are, remember that, as I alluded to earlier, to be educated is to be converted into a literate culture. We think of the world differently as educated people. If the local is not part of that, then the local is lost to our cultural understandings of what it means to be educated. Okay, and we also, have to think about the community. As you know, I wrote Flyover Country. So if you think about the readings, to whatever degree they talk about places like Nebraska, Iowa, even to some degree Vermont, some of the areas, I think in the second reading, Michigan. Much of that is now considered flyover country. It's between the two coasts. The third coast, which is the Gulf Coast, is part of flyover country as well. So how important is it to those politicians who from the two coasts tend to dominate the political conversations. Um, okay. So if we don't keep places alive in our teaching, are we not merely teaching our students to leave? This has been a problem in Louisiana, I've recognized for 30 years. Okay, I've recognized this. Coming out of my LSU experience, seeing people leave the state, particularly people who are, engineers and accountants and others of that, get degrees in those areas, often would leave the state. And I realized really in the late 70s as an undergraduate and then as a history grad student, to the degree that we're just losing our people. We're teaching people to leave. The phenomena, I've rethought the phenomena slightly when I worked in Lafayette before I came back for my PhD. And in a poor economic period, we continued, my business was renting furniture, and it continued to do fairly well. And I realized that what was happening, talking to the apartment people I worked with, that what was happening is people were leaving their rural communities in Southwest Louisiana, particularly, and moving to Lafayette, because I was working out of Lafayette at the time. And so you saw that kind of out migration within the state and then out of the state. Okay. And we've seen that in the oil patch, right? People leaving. And for every downturn in the oil industry, professionals will find opportunities in other places when offshore is closed down here. Some will continue to keep a residence here, but a lot of their work lives may be in Africa or maybe in Brazil. And then they realize, well, why stay in Louisiana if my family can get a better education, a better standard of living? Say I move to Florida, and I can still work in Africa. I still work in the offshore industry in Brazil and other places. So, so all this is interrelated. There's a lot of elasticity in labor. Okay, and we could very well begin to see, well, some of that elasticity. Well, we're seeing it now in the labor numbers now, people not returning to work, making decisions, not to return either, because the two big areas of people not going back to work are women who have decided to stay home, who don't need the extra income or decided the extra income and the cost of them working and educational cost for children and stuff, that it's better for them to stay home with their children, particularly with the great amounts of uncertainty because of COVID and schooling and everything else, continue rise in homeschooling. So that's one part of the population. The other part of the population is retirees deciding not to come back to work. For them, it may be a health decision, it may be other income decisions, it just may be time, decisions. And so those are the two interesting things. And so labor can be is fairly elastic, meaning it can move back and forth. Labor is not like food. We need to eat. Now, what we choose to eat may be different when price goes up, but we still need to eat. We still need to fuel our cars. Um, we may begin to see small cars become popular again, where you can get 40 miles to the gallon. And it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 years where some of this goes. So one of the things we can do is collect stories of place. It can be part of the assignment that you give, both from a geographic, a government, free enterprise, and historical sense. So collecting stories of place, having your students do interviews of grandparents, aunts, and uncles. This is a good way to get them to become more conscious of the local. It surprises me to the degree that students don't know more about their local history, that it may not be talked about for a variety of reasons, but it probably should be. And it's interesting, who knows something about their history, who doesn't. But collecting these stories can be important to help students get a sense of place. By collecting these stories, students come to see members of their families and community as real people whose lives have made significant contributions to this place, to the place in which they live. Developing writing projects, important writing and building school community relationships, using students to create local literature. So that's all part of the same idea. And clearly ties into this pedagogy of place, curriculum of place. I think using what is local and immediate as a source of curriculum tends to deepen knowledge through the larger understanding of the familiar and what is familiar and accessible. And it puts into action Aristotle's adage that all knowledge moves from what is known to what is unknown. So it clearly increases students' understanding of the curriculum writ large, okay, beyond what's in the scope and sequence, okay, and often gives a stronger impetus to apply problem-solving skills. So if we recognize there's a problem through local literature, then maybe we can act upon. And how do we go about doing that? As Bishop discusses Nebraska, we should think Louisiana, okay? She has a whole section on wetlands. Their wetlands are different, but still are vital, and they're linked to our wetlands because that's where the ducks and geese go in the summer. They go to the wetlands and in the prairies and plains all the way into Canada, and that's where they hang out to avoid the heat. That's why they travel north. Surprisingly, one theme is almost in it. Wetlands. Okay. So we can combine using local curriculum or local place curriculum is it sort of brings cultural studies and nature studies together to help them understand the relationship. It also teaches the stewardship of place. Bishop discusses using the Platte River in Nebraska. I've seen the Platte, although I haven't seen it in Nebraska. I've seen it in Colorado. It was the main, the main way into the Colorado Rockies for the mountain men, canoeing up the Platte, both the South and North Platte. South Platte ends up around Denver. North Platte ends up um, up into the Front Range of the Rockies. So we too can teach about waterways, bayous, and rivers in the roles that they play, and to talk about transportation. We don't, in our imagination, unless we see pictures of barges coming up by Lafourche, then we really can't imagine that. And it doesn't happen anymore up to a certain point. And you know, as far as Thibodaux, that's how we moved goods before all the bridges and all these things. So, and there was more water in Lafourche. It's a relatively shallow, there's not a lot of water movement. The oxygen densities in the water around Thibodaux are very low. That's why there are not a lot of fish. See some of the relationships. By not teaching about local place, we're aiding the loss of our Acadian identity. To whatever degree any of you identify that way, obviously not everyone does. And but that, to some degree, that still influences how everyone that lives in the Houma Thibodaux area think about themselves. So think about field trips to the wetlands, whether actual or virtual. And many of our students still live and work and play in our wetlands, and they can be a great source of information. Okay, so I'll stop sharing. That's the, I'll stop recording.